How much trouble are we really in? That's right, we're about over the next 45 minutes in this panel. I'm Ryan Heath, your moderator. You can sign up free to my Global Translations newsletter for Politico. Just Google Global Translations. The sign up box will be at the top of the page. I think our session topic says it all. So you're not going to have me rehash the last 4 years or the events of January 6th. We've got a stellar panel to dive right into all of that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Steve Israel. He's a former congressman from New York, now at Cornell's Institute for Politics and Global Affairs. Susan Glasser is the reporter we all look to in The New Yorker, and she was a former boss of mine during her days at Politico. Bill Kristol is the founder and director of Defending Democracy Together, an editor-at-large of the Bulwark. They're doing fantastic accountability journalism from a conservative viewpoint. And last, but certainly not least, Sarah Lenti, a political consultant who's now very much the former executive director of the Lincoln Project. Welcome to all of you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's just dive right in. Steve, if I could start with you. We know there's problems across all of the layers of American democracy, but Congress, it has to be said, does get the worst possible ratings. It's lost its norms. It's plainly dysfunctional. What did you see from the inside? And tell us, where is the best place to start change?
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for moderating this conversation. I look forward to hearing what my co-panelists have to say as well. Look, people say that Congress is polarized. No, Congress is bipolar. One side of the floor does not recognize the other side of the floor. And that is not a new phenomenon. That has been building for 40 years. It began in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan campaigned against government, saying government is the problem. It was accentuated in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich's scorched earth strategy, 2000 tribalized cable platforms, members either speaking to a Fox audience or an MSNBC audience, and then of course social media. But the most important unintended consequence was the weaponizing of political redistricting, gerrymandering. And I'll give you a specific example. When I was elected to Congress in 2000, I entered January 3rd, 2001. At that time, there were between 100 and 125 competitive seats, districts in the middle, where compromise was rewarded back at home. When I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, from 2011 to 2016, there were about 75 seats where moderates could win. When I left Congress, January 3rd, 2017, fewer seats. In this Congress, there are 16 seats represented by a Republican, where Joe Biden won, or represented by a Democrat, where Donald Trump won. The problem is we have redistricted ourselves, gerrymandered ourselves to the extremes to protect incumbents, which is why most of my colleagues, and I'll wrap up here, most of my colleagues did not fear losing an election to somebody from the other party. They feared losing a primary from somebody further to the left or further to the right of them, which meant they gravitated to the extremes. And that is why Congress is a place that now vilifies consensus, opposes any kind of compromise, and is just two tribes, one wearing red shirts, the other wearing blue shirts on opposite sides of the aisle.
Thank you, Steve. I'll back you up with some global context there. I'm from Australia originally, and we have a federal electoral commission. Redistricting is mandated to draw seats with a maximum 5% swing either side. They don't get it right all of the time, but it gets 80-90% of those seats right into that compromise zone. So there are ways that this can be tackled. Susan, maybe if I turn to you now, we've seen one of the very stark divisions that Steve's outlined via Congress. How important is it that we now establish a very firm baseline for democracy, having let it get out of control over the last 4 years? For example, by establishing the full facts around what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, and using that as a baseline for moving forward.
Well, I'm glad you used the word facts, Ryan, and thank you very much for doing this today. And I also am just looking forward to listening to this group and their insights, because I think that part of the temptation is to want to move on from almost anything, and to normalize the ability of the human mind and the political mind, therefore, to get used to the even the unthinkable, I think has really been for me one of the lessons of the last few years. And certainly when you talk about it's been 50 days since the remarkable storming of the Capitol on January 6th. And, once again, I find myself learning lessons that I was taught and learned and somehow never really fully learned over and over and over again through the last 4 years of the Trump era, which is to say, we're in the crisis. It is not, over because there's a different president. And what is the evidence of that? It is the inability to have a shared set of facts, or even the desire to have a shared set of facts. And I think the idea that a democracy can function without that is a proposition that we are testing in a serious way. And so right now you're in the sort of dancing around it stage where the two parties are kind of negotiating by press conference, it seems to me, largely over the terms of a possible 9/11 style commission. But the world has changed, not just since Congressman Israel became a congressman in 2001, but in the aftermath of 9/11, it was still possible to imagine the US coming together over a security threat, and a world in which you could have sort of a commission split between Democrats and Republicans and find the right mix of elder statespeople who could lead that effort and have credibility in the facts that they produced. Right now, it seems to me that unless you have no politicians involved and really experts and Congress that has nothing to do with it, because frankly, Congress failed here as well as Donald Trump failing here. And Congress failed to secure themselves. The question is why. I don't would particularly think it's a good idea as a journalist. What is the credibility of someone appointed by Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell to assess the security measures of sergeants at arms who were appointed by Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell? So I feel like the taint around our political class is one issue, but more broadly, it's because there's a lack of acceptance around facts. And I do think there is, what the political scientists would refer to as the asymmetrical polarization factor. And, watching Republican politicians, even those who spoke in scathing, castigating terms about Donald Trump and his responsibility for inciting and egging on those rioters on January 6th, to see Mitch McConnell now saying, oh yeah, but if he's chosen as the party's nominee, I'll support him in 2024. Wait a minute, you think this man should possibly be prosecuted and that he did perhaps the worst thing ever done by a president in terms of offense against our constitutional order, but you're totally fine with your political party nominating him? I mean, come on. This to me, again, just as a journalist, as someone who doesn't wear a red shirt or a blue shirt, this is very, very threatening for our democracy. I'll leave it at that.
How about you, Bill? This kind of jumble or confrontation between the need and the search for facts and also the eventual need for some form of healing and national unity. How long do we have to push for the facts and not compromise on that versus searching for that common ground? Those calls that Republicans now make in Congress saying, well, it's time to all come together before we've established those facts.
No, it's a good question. Good to be with everyone. Good to be. I wish we could be there in person in Denver. Just one point on Steve Israel's point, which is certainly correct about the House. The Senate, which doesn't have gerrymandering. I mean, it has whatever the Senate has. Different states of different size, but it hasn't changed in modern times. When I got to Washington in 1985, I looked this up. I may have the numbers slightly off, but almost half the Senate, had states in which one senator was a Republican and one senator was a Democrat. New York, where I'm from, and which Steve represented at the time, would have been Pat Moynihan and Al D'Amato, for example. But that was very common. And then about the other half of the states were split, and it was a little more. 85, the Republicans controlled the Senate, so a couple more states have 2 Republican senators and so forth. Now there's 6 states that have split Senate delegations, 44 that have totally dominated with 22 Republican, 22 Democrat, split, 50-50 Senate. So what's happening is obviously broader than, clever line drawing, also, though that accentuates the problem in the House. And it's probably why the House is even more partisan and crazy in a sense, and less bipartisanship, less cooperative than the Senate. But it is obviously a cultural, social phenomenon, sorting. There are a million deep reasons for this, so to speak. And so that just makes the problem, more serious. And you add on then the successful attempt really by Trump and then by the Republican Party that followed him, enabled him, and is now pretty much, even though he lost, and even after January 6th, doesn't seem to have departed from him much, if at all, to really create an alternate reality, to delegitimize and appeal to facts, to go not just with sort of the normal, if I can put it this way, political lies, but with conspiracy theories, which is a whole nother stage more serious and more dangerous, because you can't sort of disprove them. You can have claims about this economic policy produced better results. Someone else can say, well, here are the actual results. And if you say that over and over again, maybe you do get some, the other party retreats a little bit from just a manifestly incorrect factual claim. Once you're in conspiracy theories, there's no retreat, there's no need to retreat. Those usually in American history have petered out at some point. But if you think about it, they tend to peter out because someone confronts them. And they tend to peter out because someone from their own party or their own side generally confronts them. So when McCarthy really got, Senator Joe McCarthy really was taken down because the Army, stood up to him, or lawyer sort of on behalf of the Army, which was a respected, obviously conservative institution in 1954, as it is today, stood up and said, this is have you no shame, and so forth. And Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican president, basically orchestrated at that point the finally, maybe a little too late, but the destruction of McCarthy's career, really, and eventually a lot of the damage that he did. So there was some real damage, but it sort of faded away. But McCarthy was a senator, not a president. We've just never had the experiment of a president who is, as president, doesn't just use a little demagoguery to get elected, but doesn't use a little demagoguery on a particular piece of legislation, who as president is a relentless, divisive demagogue with strong authoritarian tendencies, with a party that didn't hold him at arm's length and sort of minimize the damage that he could do, but really enabled him, and I would say amplified the damage. So to answer your question, we don't know. We really don't know. I mean, could we be much better off 2 years from now? We could be. Could this be a decade-long problem? It could be. Could Trump be president again in 2025? He could be. But for me, the key thing would be elites, if I can use that term, on the Republican and conservative side, standing up to Trump. And that we certainly haven't seen much of.
Well, Sarah, if I can bring you in on that exact point, what are the prospects for anti-Trump Republicans? The Lincoln Project certainly mobilized them, tried to defeat Trump on his own turf with that red meat messaging. Where do they go now in this kind of, I wouldn't call it a sweet spot, but there's an opportunity. Trump is deplatformed at the moment. So if there's going to be a push either within the party or via some kind of third force, surely it would be now that they can then make their progress.
I think it's really hard right now for the anti-Trump Republicans to get a voice at all. I mean, we've seen Miss Cheney, she's doing a great job. We've heard Mitt Romney, Senator Romney, and he stands up and his voice is heard, but there's just people are not rallying around that wing of the Republican Party. Anecdotally, I come from a very Christian conservative home. My parents hate the way Trump acts, but were Trump supporters and voted for him because of the pro-life issue and because of all the noise around him. Third parties are really, really hard. Prior to the Lincoln Project, I was with this group called the Serve America Movement, and they were endeavoring to become a third party. But I think what we've learned from that and from Bloomberg's attempt to get ballot access, a sizable third party in America is most likely to always play a spoiler and either help the left or the right. And then secondly, in American politics today, the two-party system has a primary advantage that is just hard. It's a barrier that's hard to climb because of the infrastructure and the funding that surrounds that primary. And then thirdly, the fundraising is just a major barrier just because elections are so expensive right now. As we know, we just came out of it. And it's just very hard for that third party to supersede what others are raising. And I just want to go back really quickly to your point on facts. And I think what we've seen in this last election cycle, and the Lincoln Project played into this as well, with social media and new media today, populism is really colliding with the communication revolution, and the pervasiveness of social media and new media is really kind of, America's losing the ability, I think, sometimes to distinguish fact from fiction. And I think democracy is going to continue to decline so long as those facts are blurred. And so I think we're going to have to take a look at the rules that govern and shape technology and the norms of how we behave in cyberspace and so forth, so on. So I think we have a much larger issue technology-wise that we're going to have to take a hard look at.
Yeah, let's stick on that theme for a moment, and I'll open it up to each of the panelists. What would you perceive as those big structural barriers or reforms that need to happen alongside any tackling or messaging of individual candidates? What are the institutional barriers that we've got to work on in parallel with Trump the individual? Who'd like to go first? Susan, I know you've got lots of views. I'm going to turn to you.
Well, I think the problem is that there's been such a fundamental structural shift in both our politics and our media since the 80s, if that's our frame of reference point here. It's not only gerrymandering or the fragmenting of media, but it is a kind of a geographical and just a sort of a sociological sorting and sifting of people that makes for a more partisan era. And, I know we've been struggling for historical analogies throughout the Trump period. McCarthyism and how does that burn itself out is one. Another example that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which doesn't necessarily suggest our troubles are over, is to look at the wave of massive Southern resistance to the school integration decision in Brown versus Board of Education that triggered the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Because I'll tell you, I was just rereading a book about the coverage of the civil rights movement, and I just stopped cold reading the description of the Southern governors and the ways in which they incited violent racist mobs and the demagoguery as a tool. And what it did, right, in the short term was it actually silenced and disappeared white Southern moderates. That there was actually more diversity of viewpoint and more support for desegregation among white Southerners in the initial aftermath of Brown versus Board than there was over the subsequent years. That a hardline policies and divisiveness by political leadership led not only to political violence across the South, but it led to a kind of hardening of divisions and tribalism, and it escalated the violence over time rather than de-escalated it. And it's interesting because we've talked a lot about, well, what did the storming of the Capitol look like? What kind of an event was that in American history? And I just, coincidentally, reading this bit of history at the same moment, I have to say, it's a reminder that rather than the normalcy so many people crave, we could be looking at a period of more confrontation and more violence rather than, wow, that was just this terrible moment and people will be shocked and come to their senses. Can anyone reasonably look at what you're hearing from the Republican Party in the month since the storming of the Capitol and think that this is a party that is shocked itself into a more responsible position? I don't think the answer is yes there, unfortunately. If anything, it's revealed that the Liz Cheney wing of the party, the Bill Kristol wing of the party is as small as people thought that it was during the Trump era. So you ask about reforms and media reforms. I'm very skeptical that we have any kind of political consensus or ability to legislate a kind of more civil thing. I think Joe Biden is engaged right now in an experiment that will tell us something, which is to say, by consciously and purposefully changing the tone, dialing down the rhetoric, overtly reaching out to Republican governors and Republican office holders at all levels. Does changing the tone lead to any consequences when it comes to governing and when it comes to our politics? We are having an experiment in that right now, so we will see some answers to that question at least.
Ryan, may I
Yes.
agree with Susan and add a few things. Bill made the point about residential sorting patterns, and Susan reinforced that. This, I think, is one of the least understood and covered aspects of the decline of democracy. There's a guy, I love reading the Cook Political Report every day. For my money, Charlie Cook is one of the best prognosticators in the business. And he's got an analyst named David Wasserman, who actually did a survey of every congressional district in the country. And this is what he learned. If you live in a congressional district with a Cracker Barrel restaurant, chances are your member of Congress is a Republican. And if you live in a district with a Whole Foods, chances are your member of Congress is a Democrat. If you live in a district with both, chances are it is a swing district. Now think about what that means. It means that people are literally living two separate existences. No wonder they believe it's the other. If you are in a red district, you wake up in the morning, maybe you're watching Fox and Friends, and then you go to, like, if you're a congressman in a red district, you put on Fox and Friends, and then you go to the coffee shop for breakfast, and then you speak to a Rotary Club, and then you may go to a plant where every worker has the same view, and then you may do a dinner at your local Republican club, and then you go to sleep to to Sean Hannity, right? And if you're a Democrat, you wake up in the morning in the Upper West Side and you go to the Starbucks or maybe Zabar's, and then you go to the Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Women's Club, and then you have social justice Democrats, and you go to bed listening to Rachel Maddow. It's not just the members of Congress, it's all the constituents have the same experience. So yes, there are now two sets of facts. Because you
Can I ask you, Steve, because I think on the basis of that theory and the fact that our technology is becoming so sophisticated now, where we have so many choices, we can target so many interests via algorithms, that in fact, we might just be headed for a worse version of today because we'll continue to self-segregate in extreme ways.
This is what I worry about, because most people now are getting their news content by algorithm, right? They're self-curating their sets of facts. Now, there are a few things we can do about it. It's difficult, but there are structural things. Democracy does best when you have a robust and diverse middle class. The middle class has been in decline in America, so people are kind of losing that sense of cohesion and their neighbors having a different ideology. Fundamental campaign finance reform might restore some confidence in the ability of democracy to work. But these are tough structural changes. I share Susan's skepticism that we're going to be able to achieve many of them. But if we don't, we're in a boatload of trouble going forward, worse than it is today, I'm afraid.
If I can bring our conservative panelists back in now, it might be a very fragmented underclass in the US, as in the various strands might not have a lot in common, but how much can we do to address that underlying economic inequality or anxiety, which drives sort of multi-generational poverty and has put some people into the arms of Trump? What could Biden do to go via the economic route?
I mean, people are thinking a lot about that. I'm skeptical about the whole economic explanation. I mean, people aren't. I mean, for all the problems of globalization, and there are real problems in parts of the country and so forth, the empirical evidence on this is pretty mixed, and it's not so obvious that this is a big driver of what's been happening. The people at the Capitol were not mostly unemployed. They weren't mostly. A lot of them had gone to college. A lot of them, and this is true. The Trump vote. Trump did better among wealthy Americans than among poor Americans. Right? So let's not overdo the economic distress. Now, has there been, the growing parts, obviously we're all familiar with the data about the growing economic parts of the country, and those tend to be more liberal, and the declining, parts of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and so forth. So I'm not, minimizing that. And obviously there are probably things we should have done that we didn't do to try to address some of the negative consequences of globalization. I'm personally worried more the other way, though, that we'll try to address them in ways that are foolish, that will slow. Ultimately, economic growth is the best thing for people. ultimately, some people, it's not a good thing to tell young people, hey, we're going to revive your little former mill town in Northeast Pennsylvania, and you should stay there. You're not doing anyone a favor. You know what? And if that person can get a very good job in the Bay Area, this is one of these things that happens in a dynamic society. So I don't mean to be too heartless, and I certainly am aware of the political problems and constraints, but I think it's important not to be overly kind of cosseting, if I could just be candid here, of those concerns, and or pretend that they can be solved by some magic, tariffs, or I don't know, even, I mean, I'm for Romney and Biden is a much greater child credit. There are things we can do to help people make the tax code less, more egalitarian, frankly. There are some pretty standard, I would say, mostly liberal economic policies that should be pursued and that Joe Biden's going to pursue. But, I was very struck by Susan's analogy to to massive resistance to the 50s. Ron Brownstein compares it to the 1850s, the run up to the Civil War. Hopefully we're not in quite as bad shape as that. But I do think people now agree, it wasn't obvious at the time, to be fair, that the Supreme Court, when they sort of endorsed, what was the phrase they used, a gradual means, that there's a phrase in the Brown v. Board where they said, or in the subsequent litigation, where they said, we're not going to insist on desegregation right away. We're going to let the South sort of adjust to this gradually. And I do think in retrospect, that was probably a mistake. They probably should have sort of tried to lance the boil. There probably would have been more support right away for doing so. But think about civil rights. I mean, what was key? Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee in '52, had a total segregationist as his running mate. Kind of amazing when you think about it, since Stevenson was such a darling of the intellectual liberal class. John Sparkman, who was a pretty intransigent, just Southern, manifesto signer. I think Kefauver was the VP in '56. He was more mixed on race and progressive in general, populist in a way. But in '60, Kennedy picked Johnson, who had been more liberal on race, not a profile in pure courage, you might say, but had shepherded the 1957, as I recall, civil rights bill through Congress, and was more open to what was going to have to happen. Texas is a little different from Alabama, obviously, also. And then Johnson becomes president, and Johnson does the civil rights. So, is a profile in courage in terms of civil rights, whatever his other problems as president, and does it and takes the political consequences of doing it too, which he foresaw. And they break the Southerners try to filibuster, and Johnson and Everett Dirksen get bipartisan coalition to beat it. It's a reminder that you do need leadership to deal with these things. So I guess I'm coming a long way around to, I'm totally agreeing that there are, as I said, deep social and cultural and some economic problems, and social media contributes. Congress, I do think, is the most broken branch of government. The parties are broken, especially the Republican Party. Not everything in America is broken. You could argue that the Trump years showed that the judiciary is pretty reasonable. I mean, liberals don't like all these Republican appointees, but they mostly did the right thing, I think one could say, after the election, and didn't, weren't utterly partisan at all. And maybe they will be on some other issues. Executive branch were complicated, but there too, there were norms that held up and institutional constraints that mostly, I would say, held up. I do think Congress, just because of the way it's developed over 30, 40 years, combined with the partisanship, since Congress is the elected branch, and therefore the distortions of polarization, and particularly the asymmetric distortion of the Republican Party, you see it in Congress. So the nexus of parties and Congress, I do think, if you were a political scientist, is kind of the most dysfunctional part right now that needs to be addressed. But again, so these are all, and these do have possible reforms, voting reforms, and campaign finance reforms, and congressional procedure reforms, and so forth. But I do think you can't get away from the fact that you need Lyndon Johnson type leadership to lance the boil, which for me means confronting the big lie, confronting Trump and Trumpism in the Republican Party. We had a piece in the Bulwark, which you were kind enough to mention, pretty critical of a congressman who had sort of been very critical on January 7th, but now was kind of critical of Liz Cheney, because why is she still keeping this alive? Can't we just all get along and, gradually bring people over, kind of the late 50s, sort of attitude of some of the, so there's a decent person in some of this Congress. I think this congressman does not, he believes in democracy and so forth. But it's, and he had an argument with one of our writers who had written critical of what he had said. And I think he's just wrong. You need to, there's sometimes you can just go along and things sort themselves out, kind of, and time heals.
On that confrontation question.
But I don't think in this case. What's that?
Yeah, on the confrontation question, I want to give you a chance, Sarah, to come in as well, picking up that sort of Lyndon Johnson style leadership point. It just occurred to me listening to those answers, we're 5 white people here, and if economic anxiety isn't all of the answer, and leadership on some of these thorny inclusion questions is required, like how much are we not talking about race here? How much of the Trump Republican problem is dressed up racism that we just need to tackle head on as part of this process of confronting the legacy of everything going back to slavery in this country?
Yeah, I do think racial justice is something that we have to take a hard look at. Recall George Floyd and the role that played, and that really, I think we're going to look back in history and look at that moment, and you're going, I think it was a moment, and it was I think lines were drawn. I think that's where I mean, you can go back to Charlottesville and you could say that's when the real discussion on, what is America? How segregated are we? White nationalism. But I do think that George Floyd was that moment during the 2020 campaign where we saw sides divide. In terms of structural reform, I think you have to look at voter registration, right? You have to make it easier for people to vote. And I think Georgia was a great example of that. And then redistricting, we've got to stop drawing lines at silenced voices. And then when it comes to the ideological things and the views and taking a broader look, I mean, policing, there is an incongruent relationship between brown and Black communities and the police right now. Unemployment, people of color tend to be unemployed first when we hit hard times, and we're seeing that with COVID. Education, I mean, there's school segregation and how we approach ed and higher ed. I mean, these are all things to be grappled with, and these are going to take a long time to solve, and this is in and of itself isn't gonna fix our democracy. I think the other thing to remember that democracy doesn't happen by accident. We've got to work for it. We got to strengthen it. We have to renew it. And I also think that we also have to take Americans. There is this citizen responsibility angle that we don't tend to talk about. We always talk about, what can Biden do? Yes, rhetoric matters, leadership matters, but citizens also have to take responsibility for their actions. They chose to storm the Capitol, and they choose to listen and to not read and to be myopic in our views. So I think we also have to get back to holding voters accountable for our actions and for, what we expose ourselves to, and getting to know people in our community. I mean, I think it also comes back to who we surround ourselves with, and it's a huge issue.
Yeah, and on that exact point, I wanted to bring in some audience questions now. And I think what I'm going to do is combine a few of them, because there's a theme that runs through them, and it's on this theme of citizen responsibility and local action. A lot of them, including Deanna from Texas, a couple of Cornell students, they want to know what they as individuals can do to lower the temperature in America. So I don't mean to turn you all into therapists, but if we can shift away from the federal sort of big picture politics into the what can we all do in our lives to actually make this a more functioning democracy? Dive right in. Maybe back to you, Steve or Susan.
Well, we need to just break out of our bubbles. That's hard to do. And so, I used to read the New York Times and watch MSNBC. I started reading Bill Kristol as a member of Congress. I think it's important. It's hard to do, but you've got to expose yourself to other arguments. I write a weekly column for The Hill, and my holiday column every December for the past 4 years was the Trump voter that I had lunch with. I would just say, if you're interested in having lunch with me and you support the president, let's do it. And I would meet strong supporters of the president and just have an engagement with them. And we realized that we disagreed on 80% of issues, but there was 20% that we could agree on. So it's a matter of breaking out of the bubble. One more thing. I'm not a scholar of democracy, but I know practical politics. If I had a candidate that had a 37% job approval and a message that was completely irrelevant to voters, when I chaired the DCCC, I would figure out what was going wrong. I would do qualitative research.
And you're talking about democracy here? Democracy is the 37%?
He has a 37% job approval, and its messaging is completely irrelevant to most Americans. Nobody has figured out, we all have theories and we're smart people, but I think we've overlooked voters. I don't think we've done the kind of research with voters that needs to be done. I don't think we've done the focus groups to really understand why they have this animosity towards democracy, or if not animosity, this antipathy towards it. And I don't think there's been enough messaging. In politics, the cardinal rule is you meet voters where they are. Nobody's met voters where they are on the issue of democracy. We have had public service announcements on litter. We had don't just say no, don't mess with Texas.
Well, we did. We made it easier to vote in the last election. Voters loved that. It was just Republicans in Congress who didn't love it.
My point is there's been an anti-government narrative since the 1950s, really, at the beginning of, or 1960s, beginning of the monopoly of talk radio. There's not been any kind of public narrative that talks about building resilience for democratic norms and the importance of those norms.
When I was studying, I'll just say that when I was studying for this, I was thinking about the Civil War, and I was thinking about history, and I came to the point where I thought, we always look to history on how we solve our problems in democracy. And to the point on psychology, I do think it's time that we start to think about the science of the mind and behavior and what that actually could mean in American politics. I don't know how you do that, but I do think it's something to think about and to look at. And I'll say one more thing. It doesn't, I'm living in Denver, and I'm in I'd say a transitioning neighborhood, and my kids, I had the opportunity to send them to an all-white school, basically where, it was wealthier, or our neighborhood school. And my kids are the only two Caucasian children in their classroom. And I think that increment, if more parents and can make that jump and can think all of those little incremental, when we're talking about things that we can do at home, I think those small changes over time are going to make a difference as well.
Ryan, I want to make 2 points quickly. One is that the United States loves to think of itself as an exceptional country, but in many respects, it is not an exceptional country, and that this trend of declining faith in democracy is one that has been observed in democracies around the world, emerging democracies such as Hungary and Poland, which came out of the Cold War, joined the European Union, and have had authoritarian leaders, in some cases very Trumpy-like authoritarian leaders. You look at Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary. And, this is a macro trend that is existing in industrialized countries around the world. I think the shock for many people the last few years was realizing that it was happening inside the United States as well. The first constitutional representative republic of its kind, right? And so it challenges some fundamental ideas about American exceptionalism. But I think one of the questions is, Americans are always resistant to this. What can we learn from other countries that have faced issues like this? Remember that when Brexit happened in 2016, just as a sort of seen as a foreshadowing in some ways of the Trump election, it did not lead to the splintering and the dissolution of the European Union, which was one forecast that many had for it. So, what can we learn from that experience and from others around the world? Secondly, I will say, generally, I realize that this is a sort of a pessimistic conversation, and understandably so. But I would point out that the interesting thing about the challenges to our democratic system itself that Donald Trump launched during and after the 2020 election. These were breathtaking. I think they were the most serious attack by a president of the United States ever on the legitimacy of our system of government and therefore on the Constitution. It was shocking and remains shocking to this day how many Republicans have been willing to follow him into that dead end. However, what held up was our judicial system, and in many cases, the state Republican officials and state Republican parties that would not follow Donald Trump and his enablers into the realm of denying the facts as they saw them before their eyes. And you know, you can look at this both ways, of course. You can say, well, this is, you know, terrifying that it had to come down to this. You know, it never should have, especially imagine if it actually had been a close election, which it wasn't. You know, for all of the focus on Donald Trump's phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State and to the fact that the Secretary of State and the governor, who were both Republicans, withstood his pressure, actually Georgia didn't matter. And it was not crucial to the outcome of the election. But what if it had been?
In the Senate, it was crucial to the Senate.
Yeah, well, that's true, but that's a different issue because those elections were not challenged. So just talking about the presidential election. At any rate, you can, though, look at this as a positive. So when your questioners are asking, what can I do at home? You know, insisting on old-fashioned things like the rule of law, reality-based, it's much harder perhaps to engage in right-wing fever swamp conspiracy theory fantasies when it's your neighbors, when it's your own vote, or it's the vote of your father, your brother, the person that you work with, your insurance agent. It's a lot harder to throw those votes out for illegitimate ideological reasons. And so, again, the decentralization of the system, which is something we've been hearing from Republicans for decades, I think many Democrats and many observers of the system are now realizing that that also is some protection when you have someone at the federal center who is threatening democracy itself.
Absolutely.
Can I just add one word? I mean, so I just say, you know, electoral
one final thought.
What?
One thought. We're out of time, actually, Bill. But
electoral politics matters. Brad Raffensperger either will or won't win a primary in Georgia in 2022. Virginia, Democrats will either nominate a moderate or not so moderate governor candidate, you know, and these things are not, we shouldn't be too fatalistic about them. Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination and is president of the United States. He is not a radical. He believes in unity. He believes in working across the aisle. So politics matters, and get involved locally and at the local, state, and federal level in politics.
Thank you so much, Bill. I've got 2 data points to add to what Susan was saying. In a former life before Politico, I worked for both the British government and the European Union. I sadly watched too much backsliding in Hungary. And my big regret is that we didn't jump in sooner when we saw the warning signs as early as 2010 there. And I watched in Britain as governments didn't defend themselves against the onslaught of attacks on the European Union. It was decades of vitriol against that institution, and we reaped what we sowed when it came to that referendum in 2016. So the lesson is early action when you see a problem. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been a great discussion. I wish we could talk all day. We're now going to throw it over to some live cartooning. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.